the current chair with the RMS section of SAA, and welcome to Archives and Records, to the Archives and Records Management communities for joining us for our very first SAA Records Management Section, Records and Information Management Month. Our colloquium, celebrating everybody's fabulous work in the field, and especially our presenters. This was a team effort, a true collaboration with my committee, our committee, Krista Oldham, Courtney Bailey, Ryan Leemkuhler, Dave Brown, and Jess Martell, my wonderful colleagues. And the order of our presentation will be, as I dropped into the chat, Angela Ossar, Hillary Gatlin, Betty Shankle, followed by Alexander Hughes and Shannon Gavin Johnson, Beth Cron, Jessie Graham, and Anita Vannucci will be last but not least. And a reminder that this is going to be a friendly, inspiring space celebrating records management and information, and we will be abiding by the SAA Code of Conduct. And after the presentations, we plan to have questions, so you can add them to the chat, or you can wait until the end and our wonderful committee will field them. So don't be shy about putting them in chat. We will be tracking those. And thank you, Krista began recording. And if everyone gives the okay, we will be sharing this in the slides. And we will be sharing the recording with the presenters before we make it public. So thank you, everybody. And we will begin with Angela. And as a reminder in the presentation, just say next slide.
Okay, thank you, Jessica. Well, thank you so much to the RMS committee for putting together this colloquium. I am so excited to be able to present and attend such an exciting lineup. My name is Angela Ossar. I am the Records Management Officer for the University of Texas System, which I realize is not what it says on the agenda. I just changed jobs last month, so this presentation is actually going to be about work I did at the Office of the Governor of Texas. Next slide, please. I want to give a little credit where it's due. A lot of the stuff I'm going to cover here was inspired by a Nagara webinar I attended in 2016 called Separation Anxiety, Managing the Records of Separating Employees. Great title. And this is a link to the archive recording of that. As the title suggests, that webinar focuses on the offboarding process only, but it's really excellent and you should go watch it if you're looking into tightening up your offboarding process, which you should. Next slide. So I'm going to talk about onboarding first, or how we set up new employees to succeed with records management. My goal with every new employee was to give them a roadmap for properly handling information at the outset before they even sent their first email. My strategies for meeting that goal were pretty uncomplicated. I trained all new employees at orientation, and I had each employee complete a records and information entrance checklist, which I will show you in a minute. The checklist served a second goal of protecting the agency, because if anything ever went dramatically off the rails with an employee's record keeping, the checklist gave us something to point to say we made it as clear as we could what the expectations were, and they did agree to it. Next slide, please. So starting with new employee orientation. In my opinion, all new employees need some kind of introduction to RIM when they first start, because that is when they are setting up their record keeping systems. That's when they're setting up systems for saving things. At our agency, orientation was held twice a month. It was a live presentation. The RIM portion was about 15 minutes long. And I approached HR about my being there, not the other way around. If you're waiting for your invitation, it might not be coming. But in that 15 minutes, my goal was to communicate that, number one, this is a government agency, and by law, we have to maintain records. You have a legal mandate to do this. Number two, you, new employee, are responsible for identifying and saving records. So I'm going to make sure that you understand what qualifies as a state record. Number three, there's a process for categorizing and disposing of records. I'm not going to get into that process today, but there's a process. And if it's a process that you need to know because you have additional RIM responsibilities, then I will be coordinating training with you separately. Number four, be a good shared drive citizen. I'd encourage people to save work product on their shared drives, not their user drives. That was our agency policy. But this was also my librarian showing. I've seen so many chaotic share drives that I wanted to insert a brief pitch about things like using descriptive file names and following naming conventions. Some departments even had file plans. So it's just my way of saying, there might be a system, know what that system is. And then finally, I just wanted them to know that there was a person to contact with records questions, and that person was me. You have to avoid the temptation to get any more specific than this. You have to be sympathetic to how much information is being thrown at a new employee at their orientation. They're going to be more focused on choosing their dental insurance and figuring out how much money to set aside for retirement. There's very little you can expect a person to remember about RIM after orientation. So you have to choose your content strategically. Next slide. On their first day, a new employee would get a new hire packet from HR, and in that packet, they would find this records and information entrance checklist. The checklist went over the essentials of making sure that agency information was being captured and stored in the right places. This is all stuff that was in the records management policy and the IT technology use policy, but I think having an actual checklist is more helpful to an overwhelmed new employee than saying, read this 20-page policy and sign this acknowledgement to say you're going to do all the things. I think there's value in those acknowledgements too. It's just that having a checklist with just the essentials really helps a new employee kind of organize these tasks. And I had IT and information security look over the form to make sure it looked good to them and get any additions they wanted, which they did. They made a few additions on here. The form had to be signed by the employee, obviously, and then by their supervisor. That was actually the HR director's addition. That the supervisor was on the hook for making sure that the employee got the form back to me within 2 weeks. And then I would sign it, mostly because it was another opportunity to worm my way into their brains to say, hey, I'm the records person, ask me about records things. And then it would ultimately go into the employee's personnel file. Next slide. Okay, so that's it for new employees. Going on to departing employees. An employee's departure is a fragile time for information, and this is something that Nagara webinar gets into. It's easy for things to get lost when people leave. So my goals here were to first get agency records out of personal email accounts, off of laptops, out of user accounts. At the governor's office, your email account and user drive are deleted 2 weeks after your last day, no matter what might be on them. And once deleted, they're not recoverable. So this gave us a clearer conscience about doing that deletion. It was a way to say we told people to save their records outside of Outlook and outside of their user drives. Next goal was to get physical files and boxes returned to storage or any central filing systems. People will forget that they checked out a box 6 months ago. So I think it's helpful to have a checklist to say, remember you have that box, be sure to send it back. And third goal, to remind employees that destruction requires approval. We all want to leave our desks clean when we leave, but there is a process because we might get a Public Information Act request for a former employee's emails, or a coworker might just need something that the person had worked on after the employee had left. So I think reminding people of this helps protect records upon departure and ensure business continuity. Just like with the entrance checklist, we also had the goal of protecting the agency, which I'll get into. So our strategies here were just that records and information exit checklist, and then an invitation for a one-on-one consult with the records management officer if they wanted it, which they sometimes did, even executives. Next slide, please. Here's the process for that exit form. So as soon as an employee gave HR their notice, HR would email them an invitation to their exit interview and attach this checklist with the instructions to get it back to HR before their last day. It would be signed by the employee, by their supervisor, who again was on the hook for making sure it got done, and the RMO, the records manager. Once signed, it would go into their personnel file. General counsel especially liked this form, our legal department, because that first item protected the Public Information Act attorney. It's Texas law that the PIA attorney is personally responsible for tracking down information responsive to a request, even if it's on a separated employee's personal device or in a Gmail account somewhere. PIA attorneys don't like that at all. Nobody wants to go to jail. So we included this language as a thing to point to say this person attested that they provided us with any agency records that were on those personal devices or in personal accounts. It also reminded people to check in with their division directors about any existing legal hold, like a PIR, a litigation, or subpoena audit, et cetera. It helped business continuity by reminding them to turn on an automated reply to anyone who might, to any external sender who might send them an email. We'd remind them, hey, do an out of office reply to let them know that you've left the agency. And it finally reminded them that our policies state that you are not to take agency information with you without your director's approval. And you certainly are not to take the only copy of something outside of the agency. That's against the law. I want to say, by the way, I can see there are chat questions, and I think that this was probably addressed up front, but we're going to be addressing those at the end. So I'm not ignoring you. I want you to know we see that you have chat questions.
Yes, please chat away. We'll get to them at the end. Thank you.
Yes, thanks, Jessica. Okay, next slide, Ryan, please. All right, so some quick notes and caveats to wrap up. The Office of the Governor is a state agency with about 300 full-time employees. We had about 15 to 20 people coming or going each month. If you're at a university or a municipality with 10,000 employees, this probably won't work for you without some modifications. I'd say my primary role as the RMO, after the development of the form and the process, was to pester people by sending them reminders about these forms. And that pestering really helped HR a lot. It would have been ideal if we had figured out how to automate this so that a system could pester them instead of me. But I just used a tracking spreadsheet to keep track of these due dates, and I would email people, which was another way for me to make contact with them. So that was fine. And the biggest caveat here is that HR has to be involved with onboarding and offboarding. Whatever you're going to do for RIM, it has to hook into what they're already doing. Because HR is closest to the onboarding and offboarding processes. They know who's coming or going and when. So compliance will dramatically improve if you can piggyback off of something that they're already doing instead of making it a separate process. Next slide. And that's it. I'm happy to talk about this further. I'm also happy to email you those checklists if you want them. This is my contact info. Just hit me up. And thanks again.
Thank you. Hillary, you're next.
All right. Hello, everybody. So good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hillary Gatlin, and I'm the records manager for the University Archives at Duke University. And I'm here today to briefly discuss the University Archives process for surveying and collecting electronic records, particularly our renewed focus on this during the COVID period, providing some examples and sharing some lessons learned. So I'll begin with a bit of background about the Duke University Archives and its records management program. The records management program at Duke University is primarily focused on identifying materials of historical value and transferring those records to the University Archives for permanent preservation. The University Archives does not provide storage for inactive temporary records. Storage for those records is handled through third-party vendors who negotiate directly with Duke procurement. The University Archives has collected permanent records in both paper and electronic formats for many years. But with on-campus limitations due to COVID-19, Duke University Archives increased its focus on electronic records collecting. For the last year or so, paper record materials have only been collected in urgent or emergency situations, such as high-profile retirements or department closures, basically when there's going to be a reassignment or moving of space and people have to get in and out of offices. Those would be the times when we're able to collect paper materials on campus. This pivot to primarily electronic records collection allows us to maintain our collecting momentum with our offices, but it also takes into account many of the offices and departments' needs to limit the number of Duke employees on campus in accordance with the university's COVID-19 guidelines. When collecting these permanent electronic records from Duke offices and departments, the archives collects records from multiple electronic locations, including our Duke Box accounts, shared drives, and for some high-level administrators, email accounts. Before transfer, I try to perform an in-situ review of the records whenever possible and produce a spreadsheet inventory for the electronic material. The archives is trying our best to avoid taking physical hard drives, CDs, or flash drives of material. We prefer to try to collect the records in their in situ within their environment. And in particular, we're trying to move away from collecting physical hard drives where we have not had a chance to appraise the material prior to transfer. Next slide, please. So the electronic records survey process begins with an initial meeting with the department or office to discuss their records and just discuss a little bit about the lay of the land when it comes to electronic material. There's a lot of different places, as in many university environments, there's a lot of different places where people like to store university records, and we try to identify them all. Then I go ahead and ask for access to the material, whether it's in Duke Box, on a shared drive, or in email. Typically, getting that access does require additional IT support. After I receive access, I perform a folder level review to appraise the material. Basically, I open folders briefly to review what is in there, but I do not do an item by item or individual document level review of material. My focus is primarily on identifying folders that the archives does not want, including redundant, obsolete, and trivial information, as well as temporary files that are not suitable for permanent preservation. I also try to identify what material might require additional restrictions and flag any unusual file formats for our archivists and processors. Next slide, please. So this is a screenshot of the Duke Box account for a collection that was transferred just last month. Or actually, excuse me, it's April now. So that was back in February. This is from our first year advisory council program, the FAC program records. And they were transferred, they were created and lived in Box. And so we transferred them from within Box. So I reviewed the records in situ, folder by folder, and developed a spreadsheet inventory before the records were transferred to archive secure storage. Next slide, please. So surveying records in this way affords numerous benefits to both the university archives and the transferring offices. It allows archive staff to pinpoint the historical records that we wish to transfer. And in most cases, we ultimately end up taking less records than were originally found in the drive or box folder, which saves us a lot of storage space. This method is also really, really great for identifying duplicate records or folders before transfer. And if anybody, anyone who works with getting material off shared drives knows that somehow duplicate folders can be found in most locations. So we're really happy to try to avoid taking unnecessary copies of the same material. Additionally, I found that this process can be easier on departments and offices who have limited resources. Many departments are swamped with work, and records management might not be considered a high priority for them. It's often easier for these offices to just hand us the keys for a little bit and provide us access, and then have archives take the lead with reviewing their material. Surveying records in this manner also allows me to ask questions of the department if needed. Sometimes the original order isn't clear or materials are misfiled, so it's really helpful to be able to ask the office questions prior to transfer. Next slide, please. So as I survey material, I record the results in a spreadsheet inventory. This is the spreadsheet inventory for the FAC program records, and you can see it's a very basic inventory, listing only the folder and the file string, the size in megabytes, and any additional notes, which is where I list out information about restrictions and formats. Once the review is completed, I confirm that the office is ready to approve the transfer, and then share this spreadsheet with our digital records archivist, who handles the actual transfer of the materials. The spreadsheet inventory is typically added to the accession or collection control file. Next slide, please. So these inventories allow us to clearly note records that may require additional restrictions, which includes FERPA protected material, personnel related material, and donor related material. If we choose to accession those materials, those records need to be preserved in our protected data network to comply with Duke's internal data policies. So it's really good for us to flag that situation immediately. I will say that my restriction review is not the only time this material is reviewed. Our digital records archivist runs a check of common terms that can indicate restricted materials. So we end up having two sets of eyes looking for access restrictions, which gives us a pretty good sense of what material needs to be on the protected data network. This inventory also documents original order, which is really useful for the processors, particularly if there are processing delays due to our backlog. Recording size estimates is also another great benefit of the inventories. Although they're just estimates, they actually have been really helpful when planning for both our storage needs as well as the time that we estimate is going to be necessary for records transfer. Next slide, please. So as we've stepped up our process for surveying and inventorying, we've learned a number of important lessons. First and foremost, a strong relationship with IT is critical to success. This includes not only the archives relationship to IT, but also the transferring offices relationship to IT. One of the first questions I ask offices is, what is your IT setup like? And if they maintain their own internal IT department or have their internal IT representative, I try to include IT as early in the process as possible. Second, review of material like this can be time consuming. I get a lot of great information that's really beneficial to our processors, but it can take a lot longer than expected. The FAC program records I mentioned were a great example of this. What I had thought would be about 10 hours in terms of reviewing the material was almost double that. So you do have to think about the costs and benefits in terms of working in this manner. Finally, these inventories do provide a snapshot of the records in time, and oftentimes there's still changes to records prior to transfer. With some offices, we went ahead and completed the survey and inventory, but the offices haven't yet given the go-ahead for transfer. And it's been so long that we were going to have to start over the process from the beginning when the office is finally ready to transfer materials. Next slide, please. So overall, the focus on electronic records collection has been a successful pivot for the university archives. In addition to the materials I mentioned in the presentation, we've transferred a number of high-profile collections, including university secretary records, the Duke Talent Identification Program material, and Office of Faculty Advancement records electronically just in the last 6 to 8 months. We plan to continue this kind of electronic survey process, even as we work to reincorporate paper records collecting back into our records management program. So thank you for joining me today, and I'm happy to answer your questions during the Q&A period. Thank you.
Thanks, Hillary. Next is Betty. Betty, are you there?
Yes, I am. So hello, everyone. I'm Betty Shankle, Records and Archives Manager, the University of North Texas Health Science Center. The bulk of my last 2 years on the job has been spent trying to corral and bring organization to the struggling records management program on our university. Next slide. In 2018, the library took on the role, which is a new role and position, of managing non-forensic records for the Health Science Center. The Institutional Compliance Office retained management of HIPAA-related records. Part of the responsibility the library took on was that we inherited a backlog of over 300 records boxes that needed transferred to off-site storage. And this photo shows some of the records that were moved into our location to manage. As you can see, they're stacked 8 high, which is not really ideal, but they did get transferred to us. Next slide, please. Issues that needed to be addressed before boxes could be sent to off-site storage included that some departments changed names, which often happens in academia. Staff turnover resulted in departmental contact name changes that were not updated on records transfer paperwork. Chart charging strings, campus-wide, had undergone a revision and were not correct on most of the transmittal forms. A documented workflow was not in place. The records management software was, some of it was failing and some of it still is failing. There was incorrect documentation on boxes, and transfer paperwork may or may not have been included with the boxes of records. Next slide. On the left is an example of how some of the boxes looked when we received them. And on the right, this box end documents how the offsite storage vendor requested the boxes look. The solution for me was to contact departments to correct the information on the box ends, and in a few instances, replace the boxes with those approved by the offsite storage vendor. Next slide. In order to wrangle a workflow of sorts, I started meeting with departmental staff across campus and created a records management representatives, or RMR, contact base. The meetings took place over several months and concluded with a list of approximately 52 RMR contacts. Utilizing the list, records management updates, including dissemination of information related to a software upgrade, was distributed across campus through the RMRs and from there on out to staff. The RMR's contact list has proven to be a valuable resource and is a fluid document because of staff turnover and departmental changes that continue. Next slide. A working group, including library staff, IT, institutional compliance, vendor personnel, and myself, worked for a solid year to upgrade the records management software called Application Extender, which was 7 versions behind in upgrades. With it being so far behind in upgrades, it means, and we were storing information on local servers over the years, that we kept adding servers, or our IT kept adding servers for us. And so that is part of the reason it took so long for this upgrade to take place. On the left is Application Extender before the upgrade. Functionality was clunky and failing, and we had almost daily contact from staff members with software issues. On the right, what the upgraded version looks like after the upgrade. It is more streamlined and intuitive. Staff requests for assistance in navigating the software have been significantly decreased, and I have received no negative feedback related to the newer version of the software. Next slide. Autonomy Records Manager is the software currently used for offsite storage and records retrieval. Institutional compliance uses the software to retrieve records for departments and financial functions related to storage costs. Initially, I used Autonomy software for box data entry for records that were going to offsite storage. Access and functionality of the software has diminished so significantly, with only one person on campus able to access the software, and that person is me. Institutional compliance is working to replace the 2011 software. In the interim, I perform records lookups only in Autonomy for our compliance office and send them requested information through secure email. Until the software is replaced, the solution for tracking boxes going to offsite storage is to document key data in a spreadsheet and share that with institutional compliance and the storage vendor, so all are aware of our holdings. Next slide. Our transmittal and disposition forms were last revised in 2009, and updating them is a project still in the works. Upgrading the records management software took priority. For training, with the assistance of institutional compliance, I developed records management training that will become part of the required training for new hires and will be included in annual compliance training for all Health Science Center employees. This photo shows the open floor space we had in March of 2020 before we started working remotely. 2 years ago, we were overrun with boxes, and there was a narrow walking path in this space, this same space you see in the photo. This presentation has been an overview of how we have thus far wrangled our records management program to become more compliant with institutional and state records management. We continue to make progress as we develop records management procedures and investigate alternative records management software solutions. Next slide. Here's my contact information, and I am open to answering questions and appreciate your time today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Betty. Shannon and Alexander are up next.
Hi, everybody. First, we'd like to thank you for having us today. We're excited. I'm Shannon Gavin Johnson, the Executive Director of Troup County Historical Society in LaGrange, Georgia. Our Director of Records Management, Alex Hughes, and I are excited to share with you our work. Next slide. I'd like to begin by describing what Troup County Historical Society does. Usually the first thing to come to mind of a small town historical society is a small dusty room in the back of a library, only open from 1 to 3 on Tuesdays and every third Thursday type thing. Troup County Historical Society is much more than that, though. In 1972, a group of local citizens came together to create the society with the hope of preserving some of Troup County and West Georgia's history. By 1982, they held historical documents and artifacts and offered a research library and genealogical services. That year, the director approached the local governments to contract their records keeping to the Historical Society. With the funds generated from those contracts, those contracts and the boxes, we were able to grow, and they continued to grow until they were able to create a museum of history of West Georgia. Excuse me. The next slide, please. Today, we hold some 25,000 boxes for the City of LaGrange, Troup County School System, and Troup County governments. We also hold a myriad of historical artifacts and documents like local newspapers from the beginning of the county to almost 50,000 images of local citizens and their lives. Next slide, please. In those early days of our relationship with the governments, the records management went smoothly. Large numbers of records were transferred out of the dark, dank basement at the courthouse and into our facilities, better protecting the records and adding significant documents to our historical collections. The historical collections were often consulted for research projects, for undergraduate research papers, to national documentary films. Disposals were occurring regularly, ordinances were created and followed. Those creating the records called on our archivists regularly for our expertise. It was working well. Next slide.
When I was hired during the middle of 2016, I inherited a declining records management program. Excuse me. Records creators were dissatisfied with the program and their requests were not being answered in a timely manner. Due to neglect, records were unable to be located in a timely fashion, or in some cases weren't being able to be located at all. We were receiving non-standard boxes that caused many issues and even many laughs. Records were being delivered in printer paper boxes, toilet paper boxes, Reese's Pieces boxes, and my favorite, cantaloupe boxes. Records creators and stakeholders were not fully informed as to what services we were supposed to provide and why we were even in the mix to begin with. Some just saw us as an easy way to pass off the work of having to find their own records. I began to realize that our records creators were holding on to historical records that desperately needed to be within our archival repository for both preservation and research purposes. Next slide, please. This picture shows one of our 3 storage facilities. This facility was built like a bank vault and served as a fallout shelter during the Cold War. When the Archives and Records Management Program began in 1982, historic government records were stored at this facility, and they were then removed by the Archives Administration. Eventually, after the facility was occupied by the county's 911 call center, the Archives Administrator began sending records back to the facility and had the HVAC cut off. This provided a terrible environment for not only the records, but the staff working in the facility. Humidity, mold, and hot temperatures made this a very difficult and unsafe place to work, not to mention the records. Next slide, please. Over time, physical and intellectual control of records of the facility was non-existent. Bugs and rodents ran rampant through the facility and leaks were not uncommon. My predecessor remarked that you just have to map it out in your head where the boxes are and hope you don't forget. Next slide, please. Boxes were stacked on top of one another, and the climate in the facility was horrid, especially during the humid summers in Georgia. Next slide, please. While these problems stemmed from issues with both the archives and records creators, we first needed to focus on the issues that we had in our own repository and record center before fully focusing on the records creators. One of the first elements that had to be addressed was catching up on retention schedules. Destruction notices were issued and approved for the first time in over a decade, which resulted in thousands of boxes of records being destroyed. Records management staff worked tirelessly to regain the confidence and respect of records creators and stakeholders. This included going above and beyond the normal call to ensure that this was accomplished, such as making office visits and consulting about how to better organize records in their own office and what to transfer. And this ultimately went a long way in showing our value to stakeholders. Records creators and stakeholders began to notice the change and became vocal about their satisfaction. Next slide, please.
As those relationships redeveloped, we felt confident enough to approach the government to help us with the one thing that we needed most to make a renovation happen: money. After meeting with local officials and working with the local newspapers to educate the public on the importance and legal ramification of good records management, we made significant progress. Ultimately, through education and advocacy, we were able to create an intergovernmental agreement between the three entities to each contribute a third of the renovation costs. Next slide, please. So this is the outcome. The facility was cleaned out, walls were removed, it was outfitted with new electrical, new HVAC, and mobile shelving from Patterson Pope. Next slide, please. Here you can see the finished product with some of our boxes. If our calculations are correct, this facility will last us for at least the next 4 decades. Next slide.
We have seen and heard overall increased confidence and satisfaction with our institution and staff. We are beginning to advocate for and see the transfer of historical records, some as far back as 1828, being transferred to us finally. We host regular records management training and have begun to see interest and increased understanding of records management with our records creators and stakeholders. Next slide, please. All this took dedicated leadership and staff. Constant archival advocacy and building relationships were key. Sometimes the frills were a benefit, such as when our county commission saw the digitization of county commission minutes dating back to the founding of the county in 1828 to the present day. Next slide, please. We would like to thank you for the opportunity to highlight our recent work with you. We would love to hear from you. Contact us if you would like to discuss our work, strategies, or thought processes. And additionally, local government records keeping is crucial to the success of historical research and public history efforts, and we are excited to be on the front lines. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much. And now Beth Cron is up next, a former RMS committee chair. Thanks, Beth.
All right, that's right. They're good days. So good afternoon, everyone. My name is Beth Cron, and I'm happy to be joining all of you this afternoon and to be able to hear all these excellent presentations. So my question for you is, have you had to come up with a list of requirements to get a new system? And if you have you had difficulty assessing what various vendors and tools do? And then have you had difficulty assessing if those tools meet your requirements? So if the answer to any of those is yes, then no, you are not alone. So this is a challenge all the time we see in the federal government, and I'm guessing it is also the case for all organizations that are seeking to manage records electronically. So today I'm going to talk about what we've done at the National Archives and Records Administration, or NARA, excuse me, to make it easier for federal agencies to find the services and solutions that they need to manage their electronic records. So I am within the Office of the Chief Records Officer, and I'm on the Records Management Policy and Program Support team. So just to orient you to where I am I'm on the Records Administration side of NARA, and we provide policy and guidance to federal agencies on what they need to do to manage their records. So as we all hear so many times, it's important to not reinvent the wheel. It's good to look at what's already been done and let's figure out ways to leverage what's already been done. So first, I'm going to talk about the problem that we were trying to address. So we began our journey several years ago now on the Federal Electronic Records Modernization Initiative, or FERMI. And this is our effort to move the government toward fully electronic record keeping. What we want to do is to be able to preserve records that need to be kept permanently, that will be eventually coming into the archives, and manage those temporary records for as long as they're needed. So what we found is that there were gaps in knowledge and expertise between the records management folks and procurement or acquisitions people. So the records management people, they know what they want to do. They have a requirement, but they don't always know how to translate that information into the contracting language that will lead to the actual procurement of services or solutions. And so what we're attempting to do is to bridge that gap. So next. Oh, there we go. So what we did, where we started, in consultation with the General Services Administration, or GSA, we started with developing a list of universal electronic records management requirements. So this is where we started. We worked with a number of agency stakeholders. So that's important because then we were able to get buy-in and what's included. And the universal ERM requirements are just what they sound like. They identify high-level business needs for managing electronic records. They are baseline ERM program requirements, so the minimum, and they're derived from existing NARA regulations, policy, and guidance. So while you may not be a federal agency, there is a likelihood that they would align with the regulations and guidance that you have for your organization. So something to keep in mind, but they will likely need to be adapted. So we intended for these to be a starting point for agencies to use when developing system requirements and program requirements. And then records management staff should work with the acquisitions and IT personnel to tailor any final system requirements. So there is a risk with a one-size-fits-all approach that it may not fit completely. You know, you're going to have be too loose in some areas and not fit right in others. So that's an acknowledgement, but this is the baseline requirements, like the minimum of what's going to be needed. And then each organization is going to have additional ones based on either statutes, regulations, or policy. So if you go over to this page, and I'll drop the link in after I talk here so that you can go and look at it, and you can download the spreadsheet, and it contains a few tabs, has an abstract, as a list of the requirements that are organized by the records lifecycle. It lists out the transfer format requirements. So these are for permanent records that NARA will take, and a glossary. And so what I want to tell you all about today is how we've seen agencies using this document when they're identifying how to meet all of these needs when procuring or implementing a new system. For example, going through this document to identify how you meet all the requirements in SharePoint or Microsoft 365, as we've all been talking quite a bit about. You can use them as a starting point when writing a statement of objectives or a statement of work for ERM tools and services. So for example, if you're writing a statement of work or a performance work statement for an email management tool, you can pull out the system requirements and you can filter by those in the sheet and add any requirements that may be specific for your needs. Or if you want a vendor to provide some kind of ERM services or consulting services, you could just filter on those program requirements. Next slide, please. So acquisitions and IT departments, they often ask records managers to provide requirements when purchasing new systems. So they just want to know what you need the system to do. And figuring all of that out and writing those requirements can be a very resource intensive process. So what we've heard, what you could do is give these requirements to your IT department and avoid having to create a new list for each new acquisition. And possibly when they say that's too much, you could just provide the metadata requirements or decide which subset is most important for your organization. Next, please. Another example we've heard is incorporating a tailored version into your system development lifecycle process. That may be called different things, but this is just from the beginning to the end of the process of a system. So in an ideal world, what this would look like, we would aim to see records managers involved and at the table from the very beginning to make sure that records management is addressed in all systems. And what you could do with this approach is if it's built in, IT must show how they're going to meet this requirement, and it's like a checkbox. You have to check the box to make sure that you can meet the need to manage records in a system, that you'll have a retention applied, that there can be transfer out of the system, and also destruction. Next slide, please. Another one we've heard is attaching the requirements to a request for information to say that you need a solution that will meet these requirements, and that can be done through whatever system or way that you do procurement. Next one. And this is one of my favorite examples that I've heard, and this is just to take the spreadsheet. So it's an Excel file, you can download it. And I don't know if you'll be able to see it, but if you add a few additional columns, I have a few examples here. You can add columns to show user action, how the system will meet that requirement, if there's any custom development that may be needed, and be able to estimate the level of effort that would be required or the cost to develop that, so you can have an idea of how you're going to meet all of the requirements with actual concrete numbers. And you can get an idea of how manual your process is, and how your system, if your end users are having to take a lot of the steps, then you could, that would show where there could be a case for automation or using an additional tool to automate that piece of the process. Next slide, please. So we are cruising right along. So this is just a piece of the work that we're doing with the Federal Electronic Modernization Initiative. And if you want more information about it, I could point you to a number of blog posts and presentations that we've done. Or if you're sick of hearing about it, that's fine too. So please feel free to take all of the Fermi resources and repurpose them for your own organization. And if once you start looking at them, you have questions about it, please just let me know. Really a good place to stay up to date is to check out our Records Express blog. Next. So we are also, so the piece with Fermi is we're producing the tools like the Universal ERM requirement sheet. And we're also working with two different parts of GSA, the General Services Administration. And the first one is we are working on incorporating electronic records management into mission support shared services across the government. So what this means is for various mission support functions, so the things that agencies need to do to meet their mission needs, such as financial management, travel, HR, cybersecurity, These are all functions that every federal agency needs to do. And what we want to do is to build electronic records management into all of those systems, all of those services that agencies will acquire. And so NARA is the lead for electronic records management. And this is very exciting for us because, as you can see on the slide there, all of those other areas, we are actually incorporating ERM functions into all of those other areas. So to the degree where we're actually identifying what records are created in a process. So real property management, for example, if an agency is acquiring property, this is where the records are going to be created. And we hope that we can also have retention applied in that system. And it's all part of our goal to automate electronic records management as much as possible. So it is very exciting work, and I'm happy to share it with all of you today. I think next slide might have one more. So also we are looking at creating some resources. So what I was talking about, bridging that gap between the records management and procurement side. We've put out on the Records Express blog a sample statement of objectives for an ERM program needs assessment. So you could check out that. There is a risk, and if you've ever tried to repurpose another organization's a SOU or a SOW, then you're going to know that it's going to be difficult to put in all of your specifics, but they can be a really good place to start. Just know that it's not going to fit for everything. So that is all I have, and I'll look forward to any questions that we have later on, and I will drop the link in the chat. So thank you.
Thank you, Beth. That was wonderful. And Anita and Jessie are up next.
Hi, I'm Jessie Graham, and I'm going to hopefully start my video here. Okay, Anita and I are going to talk about the University of Virginia's travels going remote during this pandemic crisis. And I'm Jessie Graham, and I'm electronic records manager at UVA, and Anita is the senior records analyst. We are a group of 3. I think our supervisor, Caroline Walters, is also listening in today. She is the University Records Officer, but today we'll be talking about the evolution of UVA's training program from a pre-COVID traditional in-person format to a totally virtual pandemic training environment. We'll discuss the tools we've discovered and used and address a few lessons learned along the way. Next slide, please. Okay, so the way it used to be, and this is a visual of that, we scheduled meeting spaces, we ordered cookies and coffee, spent an hour or 2 for each in-person training session, and sometimes upwards of $100 for the catering, not to mention the travel and setup time for the rooms and to get there. By mid-2019, we were seeing diminishing attendee numbers, and in a few cases towards the end of that year, we had sometimes 1 or 2 or 3 people show up. So when you're spending $100 on catering to feed 2 or 3 people, you start to wonder, okay, maybe something needs to change. Next slide, please. Okay, so a disclaimer up front, we're not specifically recommending these companies, just highlighting a few tools that we have used. Back in 2017, we actually started using a free Canva account to create tip sheets and other infographic type things. The tip sheets were popular, and we've used them extensively as handouts at training and at conferences when things were back in person. Over the past few years, we also created several short instructional videos, think like those step-by-step filling out of forms or how to use our records management system. The videos were more like tools and not so much training in the formal sense. We used Blueberry, which is now Flashback recording and editing software for those early videos. It worked fine. It was just a little bit clunky, and it did cost money to procure and maintain. So we've moved away from that. In late 2019, I guess the timing was pretty good. We started working toward offering our pre-existing training as webinars via Zoom. So we were already thinking about it, but we had lots of ideas, but the full implementation of virtual training had not happened by the end of 2019. Next slide, please. Okay, so here comes March 2020. So we'd been thinking about it. But of course, like most of you did, we went from working on site to working from home over the course of a weekend. So we were mid-semester and mid-established training schedule. We started offering our training webinars via Zoom, but the presentations were the same slides as in person. And in a lot of cases, we're kind of text heavy. This led us to question whether the sort of same old training was as effective when held virtually. Sometimes things didn't flow as smoothly or translate the same way when in a virtual environment. The effectiveness issue was especially important because our training attendance numbers went through the roof those first few months during the pandemic. Sometimes we were in the neighborhood of 60 to 80 people per session virtually. Like I said earlier, in person, we were lucky to get 10 people toward the end of 2019, and in some cases, even lower than that. So I will note, though, that virtual attendance numbers did drop off after the first few months as people figure out how to fill their work from home time and things other than training, but certainly remained higher than in person for all of 2020. So what did we do with this new environment? The first thing we did was revamp the slides. Anything that was heavy text, we felt distracted from what the presenter was saying. We started using more of the PowerPoint smart art and images from Canva to make the slides visually appealing, but kept the focus on the speaker. Also, the new virtual format allows us to do live demos, which is sort of different. We couldn't really do that in a large format in-person training, so we've focused on demoing our system and demoing some of the Office 365 stuff. So that's been a good improvement. A few other things we did start doing as we got more comfortable with Zoom was to use polls to get conversations going and to keep them moving, and to use chat for questions. We sometimes save time for questions, and at other times we actually answer them in real time. It really depends on the group of people, what kind of questions are being asked, but that virtual environment allows us to kind of keep that flexibility, so that's nice. We do like to keep cameras off, typically to preserve bandwidth and to avoid distraction. After the trainings, we send a link to a recording if we created one, as well as a PDF of the slide deck, and we include a link to a feedback survey, which we're starting to reassess due to lack of response. So we're thinking of ways to get people to answer those questions, one of which is using a QR code instead of a link that people have to click to find the survey. One note, we do use UVA's learning management system, which is Workday, for our webinar registration and attendance tracking. And we have found that using this kind of a formal system has made attendance metrics easy and convenient to figure out, which was something that we didn't have a great grasp on before. Well, now that we've covered the changes to live training, I'm going to hand it off to Anita to talk about some of our on-demand training. So next slide, and there you go, Anita.
So along with revamping our live training, we also wanted to move towards more on-demand. So to that end, we took our Records Management for All class, which was a 1-hour in-person basic course, and we turned that into a 30-minute, 10-module RIM on-demand class that is loaded into our LMS. It can be taken all at once or in pieces, whatever works best for the learner. We are using Zoom to create this content. So one of the things we found with Zoom, if we record to the cloud, Zoom would create a transcript for us. Unfortunately, that sometimes caused audio problems and lag if there were internet speed issues. But when we record locally to our desktop, we didn't get a transcript. So we're using Video Text Track Creator, VTT Creator. It's a website where you can create transcripts for videos. You can do that for free using your script and uploading your script, or for a really small fee, the site will create a transcript for you from your recording. And when I say small fee, I mean $1, $2 for a short video. It's very affordable. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. Sorry, can you hear me?
Are we on the pandemic pivot tip sheets?
Yes, there we are. Thank you. I must have had a lag. That's why, as Jessie said, we don't often use video. So with the tip sheets, we also wanted to increase our use of those tip sheets that Jessie mentioned, focusing on the tools that folks were using more as they work from home. So for us, that was Zoom and Microsoft Teams. I'll mention here, we did upgrade to Canva Pro. Canva Pro is $120 a year. We did that really so we could get branding options, but Canva Free is also excellent. So still recommend Canva even without a pro account. With the videos, we wanted to supplement some of the training material. So in addition to RIM Basics, we created some managing record type videos, managing financial records, managing student records. And we created about 6 of those to kind of replace some of the more tailored training we had previously done, as well as doing some videos around those tools. So again, we've seen a lot of interest in Microsoft retention labels and applying those labels in Outlook, Teams, SharePoint. And so we've created a series of videos for those as well. The educational content we tend to place in our LMS. The instructional content we put on YouTube, which is free and linked to our website. So that's been a great resource there as well. Next slide. The reality for us here is that this has worked really well for us. We're going to continue doing this even after we return to grounds. We're saving money by not catering events. We're saving time by not traveling to events, not doing setup and tear down. But really, for us, the biggest reward has been it's freed up some of our time to do more consultation and projects that we wanted to do, and we're reaching more people. People who never would have come to our live training, either because it was hard for them to get away from their office, it was hard for them to step away from the desk and travel to an in-person training, or because of accessibility, it was harder for them to do live events as opposed to something on demand or virtual. We're getting more people and we're getting a different group of people than we used to get. And so this is it for us now. We're going to be doing this type more and more even going forward. Next slide. So before I turn it back over to our moderators, I'll just mention all of the resources Jessie and I mentioned are available on our website. If you are interested in seeing something that's in our LMS, you'll hit a sign-in log and you won't be able to get past that, but we can absolutely share that with you. So feel free to email us, records@virginia.edu, and we're happy to talk about the resources we've used or share any of the tools that we've created. Thanks.
Thank you so much. Such fantastic presentations. I believe it is true, we have finished. And so now we will open up the floor to questions. I think starting with the chat, and Courtney is going to give an introduction to the questions and field them.
Yeah, so before we start discussing some specific questions, some of which have already been put into the chat, some of which you may be thinking about and want to ask in person, but I just wanted to make sure that everyone is aware that we have launched a new case study series for records management under the auspices of SAA Publications. And so you can see the link there. You can find more specific information about it. But basically what we're looking for is for folks to share their experiences. What are the things that you've worked on? They don't all have to have worked perfectly. Obviously, a lot of us can learn from, missteps and roadblocks just as well as we can learn from great successes. But the important thing is that we help each other and that we're not all trying to solve the same problem in in isolation. So I definitely encourage you to look into that. Not a huge lift in terms of preparation, and it's certainly something that we on the steering committee are willing to help you through the process. So I encourage you to look through that, whether you have presented today or whether you have other work that you are looking for an avenue to share with your colleagues. Please consider this case study series. All right, so I do have some questions that have come in that I can start off with, and it could be that some of you presenters have also received some directly, so we'll try to get to those as well. But let me go through first the ones that I have to make sure that I don't overlook anything here. All right, so Angela, a question for you. Do you ask for any physical records that were created when you offboard employees? And I think I'm misrepresenting that question. So if there were physical records that the employee had created, is that part of that checklist of offboarding?
I have to look at the checklist. I don't think we say it specifically. I'm not sure we talk about physical records versus electronic specifically. It's just kind of said, you know, have you ensured that all records in your possession are captured in official record keeping systems and will be available to agency staff after you leave? So, I mean, it's kept pretty broad. It doesn't get into the specifics of physical versus digital, but I think it's kind of covered under that.
Okay, because presumably there is some sort of system for physical records as well.
Yeah, I mean, we found that most physical records tended to be copies of digital things because most records are created digitally. And so, you know, if you had a physical copy, you know, usually that would just be a reference copy. And the official, but you know, that if it was a record where the official record was considered to be the paper version, then that would be captured under centralized filing system. You know?
Okay, very good. All right, Hillary, I have one for you as well. How do you go about identifying the duplicate records or the duplicate folders? Is there any particular tool that you use to do that?
So I don't use a particular tool like tree size or something like that. I would love to use a software like that, as I think that would be very helpful for that process. So right now it's mostly done just kind of by looking at the folders and like looking at file properties and folder size and number of items within. And then I flag the potential duplicate folders during the process, and then I will discuss with our digital records archivist and make sure that that we are correct and they are duplicates before we decide not whether or not to take them from that. Yeah, so yes, I would love to use a software like Tree Size, and I see a lot of people chiming in about how awesome Tree Size is.
And sort of a related question, I think you sort of touched on this, but just to make sure we're all clear here, how do you obtain the file names or folder names for your spreadsheet? Is that automated in any way, or is that just when you're looking through the records as they currently exist?
That depends a bit on, again, going back to the importance of the relationship with IT, that can depend a lot on the IT resources. Sometimes it is automated if I'm working with an IT department that feels comfortable exporting a list of files. A lot of times this happens when we're looking at email. They will just export the email folder structure and we'll go from there in terms of just the names. But like for the example that I showed on the slide, that actually was done manually. And that's another thing that I would love to have automated if possible as a time saver.
Okay. Shannon and Alex, one question for you, and I'm not sure if you were there to be able to answer this, but just in case. Can you give us any insights into what caused an efficient records management program to deteriorate? Like, are there ways that we can anticipate, you know, if any of us might encounter the same situations, are there ways that we could anticipate or mitigate those problems? Like I heard money was one thing, and that's kind of predictable, but anything else we could
I mean, that's across the profession, money is a thing. I think money in regards to poor administration was one, and I don't want to get in the weeds on that, but I think additionally, just lack of records management training was the big thing. If your face is not in front of your records creators, you're going to decline quickly. They'll forget why you're there. I mean, I saw in some other presentations, turnover is huge, especially in local government sometimes amongst several of our clerk positions within the departments. So they immediately don't realize why you're there. And especially now that we're looking at both electronic and physical records, the understanding of where these physical records need to go. So yeah, but I think the biggest thing too, one, administration, and then two, not advocating, not getting in front of trainings is definitely a way that it'll decline.
Okay. All right, Hillary, another one for you. Have you run into situations where the records creators resist giving access to their files? And if so, how have you handled that?
Yes. So I love to get access to everything, but there are obviously very valid reasons for why departments would not want to give access to everything in terms of review. So one of the ways that we've managed that is if we have an office that is interested in transferring records, but they don't feel comfortable allowing us access to everything on their shared drive, for instance, I will set up like a Zoom consultation, and then we will use screen share to review the files actively with the office going through and telling us, okay, this is what we have, let's look at this. That takes a lot longer and is resource intensive for them, but it has worked and allowed them to provide us access in a way where they feel comfortable doing that. And I don't know if that question was also addressing people who don't feel comfortable giving access or transferring anything to the archives. But one of the things that I like to emphasize when I work with offices is that we're asking for temporary access, which usually calms some nerves. I think when I've worked with IT, I notice asking for temporary access and sometimes even saying, we estimate will only need to be in here from like for a week will smooth over some hurdles.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Let me pause you for a second. Is there anybody, any participant that wants to raise your hand and ask a question directly? Okay, well, that option will remain on the table, but I will go ahead until someone does want to raise a hand. So Hillary, another question for you. You mentioned about having some records on a protected data network. So is this actually like a separate repository? And if so, if you have things from one collection that wind up in both places, then how do you keep track of the parts of the collection that are some in the protected, some not?
Yeah, it's not an access repository. It is different internal storage within our archive secure storage feature. It has additional security measures on it, which allow it to be in code with Duke's internal policies. But so we do have collections that are split sometimes with some of it in our standard storage and some of it in protected data network. And we do track what collections are where. And we do ultimately we keep track of it via metadata and other methods from that. That's more of a technical question that's not necessarily my area of expertise, but we do know what parts of what collections are located on the storage. In terms of access to that material, it is all put together when we do a finding aid and when we allow access, like whether that's through reading room or for collections that are are limited and for reading room access to our electronic materials, which is the vast majority of university archives collections, because we have a lot of restrictions on materials, and we keep track and we can allow access in that way when obviously once restrictions are passed. But yes, it's not a separate. There aren't two public facing repositories where people have to go for part of the collection and part of not. Okay. I hope that answers that question coherently.
I believe so. So here's a question that several of you might have some feedback on, because whether you're talking about appraising records or thinking about, long-term, what are the historical records for a locality that need to be preserved, is there any kind of guidance that you provide to your people in terms of something as simple as file naming? And are there ways that you figured out that your job processes, like I said, with the appraisal or other things, can be simplified over the long term? So like I said, I could give that to any of you. I sort of see that that could be Angela or Hillary or Shannon and Alex. Any of y'all might have something to say on that.
I've been talking for a while, so if anybody else wants to chime in on that.
Could you pose the question once more?
So there any practical like file naming protocols or anything like that, that folks have set up that either help in the management of records, the appraisal of them later on, the long-term historical preservation, any of those aspects?
I'm going to drop a link in the chat to this great article that inspired me on this from the Texas State Library and Archives Commission blog, the Texas Record. They shared a shared drive cleanup success story, and in it they shared kind of their file. I think it was like a file plan, but they shared their naming conventions. I think it's hard to give kind of universal best practices for naming conventions. It's really going to depend on the organization, the department, the records creators. But I found it to be useful, so I'm sharing that now.
Great, thank you.
Sure thing, and a little more practical, I guess, for us in terms of thinking of it, not so much in digital records, but in physical records that we had originally had to start looking at. One was just creating a box label to begin with, and you see the boxes that come in with cantaloupes, and they don't think my records are going into a facility with tons of other departments, so clearly I'm the only department there, and they won't put things like their department names, and also getting them to understand records groups, which is a wonderful way to then teach them retention schedules. So to get an idea of, okay, you only want to put one records group or series within this box, and so kind of getting them to understand that language helped as well, just to add there.
Very good.
I'll jump in on a point Angela made regarding not getting into too many specifics. One thing I've seen when working with departments is just advising them to come up with a file naming convention, whatever it is, and then write it down. So they have a record of it somewhere. I think I found that is a lot more helpful than trying to dictate, what the exact order is, because every department does work differently. Different types of transactional records versus other types of records may have different concerns. But yeah, that's one thing to keep in mind with file naming conventions.
All right, so I got a follow-up question that's based on what Hillary was saying about gaining temporary access to files for appraisal purposes. So the question is for the rest of the panel. Has anyone set up a policy for their records management or their archives program that specifically addresses or establishes your role and your ability to access records?
I will say, just in our experience, we actually had, and we didn't really speak on this much, we went through the county attorney and the city attorney ultimately to establish several ordinances that allow us to do that. I will tell you that we have gotten quite a bit of pushback from IT in not really wanting to support that ordinance, but it does come in handy when you can put an ordinance to what you're saying to access records. Our HR department has tended to be very, and there, we have gone to digital repositories and such, and our human resources department has had to understand that we are under confidentiality agreements and the like. So for us, it was a codification through ordinances, which ultimately then allow us to write policies that are attached to the ordinance.
Okay. Anybody else have feedback on that one? And sort of an offshoot from that, are there any people who have tried to develop relationships with specific folks to help develop your programs abilities and responsibilities. So general counsel, auditors, president's office, depending on your organization. Obviously, this is coming from an educational perspective, but are there any particular types of folks that you found useful in ensuring your access to records?
I can speak to that. I have worked with dean's offices, and that is most helpful, because if the dean of a department or a school or college on your campus is interested in records management and they're invested in it, then they make sure that their whole school or college is following protocols. And so that has been most helpful to me to ensure, that I get what I need from those staff and faculty that fall within that school or college.
Very good. Anybody else on that one?
I'll chime in from the UVA perspective. As far as being remote, we have worked with IT extensively, especially in terms of e-discovery, because that's also something unit handles when you're talking about Microsoft products and Teams usage and OneDrive and email through Outlook. Being able to access that meant we absolutely need IT assistance with that, and it's worked out really well. We've worked out some processes that have really helped that process along. So if you could make friends with IT, I would.
Very good. Anybody else?
I would just second what Jessie said, making friends with IT. IT became mine and library staff's best friend when it came to upgrading records management software to facilitate transfer of records from physical to electronic. And getting that software upgrade done, we couldn't have done it without IT backing us all the way. We were holding most of that year that it took for that transition. We were holding weekly meetings with the vendor also, and so it was an ordeal. But making friends and staying friends with IT, and for us also institutional compliance and the vendor, was imperative to get from point A to B.
Very good. All right, I see a hand up now. So Elizabeth, if you can unmute yourself and go ahead and ask your question.
Great. Hi, everyone. I first just want to quickly say thank you to everyone for these fantastic presentations. They were incredibly informative and engaging, and they covered topics that I, as a records manager, deal with every day. So this has been so great. My question is for Angela. I'm curious how successful your offboarding has been. I do have an offboarding process, but it's kind of incoherent right now. So I'm just curious if there are incentives, because I mean, I don't mean to sound pessimistic, but I'm just afraid that, when employees are leaving the company, and this may not really apply to terminated employees, but their heads are in every place else except records management, and then they're gone. So I was just curious how successful offboarding has been, and if you have any particular incentives that you could speak to. Thanks.
I can say, so I would get requests sometimes from the executive office, which is always terrifying. You'd have to put on a suit and walk over to the Capitol, and it's like, what am I going to say to these people who are so busy, who are going off to head another agency to try to make them care about their records? And so, for them, I would talk about, this is your legacy. This is protecting, the information that you created. This is this is what is the long-lasting stuff of your, your service to this agency. And, I found that would be important to them. I think for most people, honestly, there wasn't really a compliance check to make sure that people really were handling their records before that, not just signing off on it. That was a calculated risk that we took. We knew that things were gonna get deleted that probably shouldn't. And the best we could do was just at least put it in their minds to think about it and have them sign something. You know, they have where they're saying, yes, I did take care of my records. I don't know that, you know, you're right. When people are leaving a place, like they might not be that concerned with their stuff. They're thinking about their next job. But I think it did protect the agency, at least to say, hey, we, you know, informed them what the policies were. We reminded them, you know, the policy before, the procedure of deleting people's user drives and email accounts, that was in place long before we had the form. So I think at least it was an improvement to have a form to say, hey, remember, there are laws about this stuff that you've created. You know, make sure you're familiar with it and promise us that you've followed these. So I feel like that was a rambling answer. I hope there was something useful in there.
All right, very good. Ryan, it looks like you have a question too, so why don't you go ahead?
Yes, thank you. Ryan Limekiller here from Kansas State University. And this question is also for Angela. But we do not have any process right now about onboarding or training and onboarding. But that is something that is definitely on my agenda to do over this next year. So I wanted to get a feel for what was your timeline or kind of time frame from kind of conception to implementation? Because we do have a lot of political red tape to cut through, definitely working with some of HCS. So I'm interested to see what your take on that was.
Things move pretty fast at the governor's office. I mean, I like once I had kind of gotten in my mind, like, hey, we need to I mean, I think I just approached HR because HR handles all the, you know, the onboarding, and they're in charge of orientation and the presenter lineup. And, you know, I basically just asked for a meeting with the director and said, I think that we should be talking about records management and orientation. I'd like as much time as you can give me. Can I have, you know, 15 minutes? They said, okay. And I put together a presentation. I sent it to them so they could make sure they were happy with it before I started presenting to people. But that was that. I mean, it's a very simple presentation. Like I said, I kept it really general. I didn't really get into the weeds of, you know, procedures for disposing of records or how to categorize records with our, you know, records retention tool or anything like that. It was just, you know, it was just real basic stuff. So I didn't have any pushback. I you know, from conception to execution, a couple weeks maybe. I mean, it moved really fast.
Very good. All right, so here's a question that is intended for any of the presenters. So we have an attendee who's an archivist in a medium-sized corporate institution and is looking for some advice on how to get stakeholder buy-in to start a formal RIM program where one does not currently exist. So how can you, you know, get people to buy into this idea of trying to centralize records management? Anybody have any thoughts on that? If not, I may tap my colleague Ryan because I know he has some experience with this too.
I mean, okay, I'll chime in. I think it's, it really depends on your organization, what's going to appeal to executives, you know, what's important to them. Is it important to minimize risk? You know, I've worked at organizations where, you know, the lawyers didn't want us keeping things any longer than we absolutely have to. So making sure we were, you know, following the law, but getting rid of things, you know, as soon as they were eligible for, you know, for disposition was really important. You know, now I'm working for a university system, and it's important to, you know, I think the appeal is, you know, let's be smarter about the information that we are keeping and using, because it makes us, you know, serve our institutions better. You know, it makes us, it makes us smarter when we can put our hands on information quickly. So I think it really depends. I think for me also, it was helpful when I was studying for the CRM exam. I did that like shortly after I took my last job. That really kind of gives you a good overview into, you know, what records management is, just kind of the bones of a records management program. And you can kind of look at, you know, what are the principles, look at RMS principles, see like what the components of a good records management program are, and see what of those things you think might appeal to your particular organization.
Very
good. To add on, I think for us, at least in acquiring the funding and support for renovation of facility, we had to really go back. I mean, because obviously our records management program had declined wildly. So we both had to advocate for the program and the additional funding to do things. And so for us, I think one thing that we probably had a corporate environment doesn't have is we had, you know, the public law on records to really say you are legally bound to properly take care of these records. But beyond that, I think, you know, our county commission, like many others, but I try to think that ours is somehow, you know, a lot more focused on money. That you know, what's the bottom line? What's the bottom line? And so I would imagine in corporate, you know, America, that's a big thing too. So we talked about, hey, you know, if we get these boxes out, or if we get these, you know, you can talk in digital records too. You know, if we can get more server space, and you're not having to buy more stuff, you're not having to buy more space. And Shannon kind of mentioned how long we look at these facilities lasting us. And so when we could say, look, you know, here's our calculations, here's how we did it, but we look at, you know, in the next 20 to 30 years, this facility, you know, and their comments were good because I'll be gone by then. So then it won't be a matter of, you know, me having to deal with it. I think that was a big sale. And then, and also, you know, the liability of keeping records long-term, you know, that sold it to the attorneys, and to the commissioners. They don't want to be in lawsuits. You know, they much rather say, hey, that's been destroyed. So those are my thoughts.
Very good.
And I was just going to jump in as well. I think the things that have already been said, it's kind of the carrot or the stick approach to the program. The carrot obviously is going to be saving money. I think I saw that in the chat. Saving money for storage, physical storage, being able to destroy of records if they're no longer needed, or on the other side, the risk and being able to comply with any relevant statutes and regulations. And I think to that end, I would also recommend, if possible, getting a senior leader who's a champion of your program. Someone at a high level that has insight into how money is spent and decisions are made. So I think having that cheerleader at the high level.
Good idea. And since several people have brought up the cost of record storage, I just put a link into the chat. Last year for RIM month, I did some post about calculating the storage both for paper and electronic records. So if you fall into the category of needing to sell people on financial savings, then those calculators might help you. All right, let's see. Ryan, you have another question?
Yes, this one's for Anita and Jessie. Do you feel like when you went remote, did you lose anything from your in-person trainings? I know your participation was low, but do you feel like you lost any kind of capacity as you are moving to virtual? Thank you.
You know, I mean, obviously you lose that sort of personal connection, and there's always going to be the folks who really prefer to learn in person and to have somebody that enjoy the virtual. But the whole, just the fact that we've been able to reach a wider audience has been a bigger gain than that might be a loss. So I would say it has been almost entirely positive, and I'll let Anna weigh in if she has a different opinion or not sure. But I think really on the whole been a very positive move for us.
I agree, and I'll just add that I think as we got more comfortable using Zoom and started incorporating more polls and specific pieces where we'd ask, put this into chat or ask questions and encourage engagement, we picked some of that back up. So initially it felt very like talking to a brick wall, but we've gotten a lot more engagement with the chat and the polls features.
Very good. All right, so I have to confess, I don't know the status of our presenters in terms of if you're working from home or working in your offices at this point, but we've gotten a question of if there are any types of considerations that an organization should put in place to acknowledge that home offices might be here to stay. So does anybody have anything to add to that conversation?
I'll jump in and add one of the things that we were really interested to see was a lot of offices who had previously really resisted going to electronic processes were suddenly very interested in knowing how they could digitize documents and how they could transmit things electronically now that they were no longer able to walk it to someone's office or use inter-office mail. And so we created some digital imaging guidelines and have had some good conversations with our info security team about how to better transmit information electronically when people are not all in the office or not even on the network. And so it's been a good opportunity for us to get into some of those conversations as well. And we're actually working with IT right now to procure an FTP transfer service that folks could use for that kind of digital transfer of information while we're keeping it secure and, you know, who has access to it. So in some ways, this move to work from home has created some opportunities for us to get involved in some processes that we weren't previously a part of, or that we had been trying to convince people to move towards and they just weren't interested.
Good point. Anybody else have any thoughts on that? Neil, do you have a follow-up you want to ask?
Yeah, so that was my question. I just wanted to say that one of the facets that I'm having some discussion about is folks are printing things at home, and we're trying to figure out how to destroy those copies efficiently, whether or not we're going to offer shredders to people who really need to print at home. Obviously, we don't want people to do that as much as possible, but that's just one of the facets of this this new kind of split bifurcated reality between at home and at the office. Thanks.
Not to put you on the spot, but I know Virginia, I believe, is a state that has some requirements about destructions. Do you all have anything to add to that particular question?
We do. It's been interesting. We're required to destroy records within a year of retention expiring, 6 months if they're confidential or privacy protected information. And the reality is if it's paper records and folks haven't been in the office for the last year, they're not doing destruction. So as we've seen people going back to the office, we're starting to get more word of folks who are saying, all right, I've got recycling scheduled. They're coming on Thursday. We're going to do this destruction you approved over a year ago. And we're just taking it as it comes. But yeah, we can't do paper destruction when you're not with the paper. But it's certainly with the electronic, we've seen an increase in reporting of electronic destruction.
Because I would wonder if, even if it's printed out at home, is it a record or is the electronic copy? Just because it's getting printed out doesn't mean they necessarily need to keep it. But that's all about your training and guidance that you're providing them.
Any other thoughts on that? One question back to you, Hillary, and it could be that your digital archivist may have the answer to this instead of you, but just in case, do you know anything about the tools that are used for the transfer process for your electronic records?
Yep. So I can't speak into tons of specifics about this because it can vary based on, you know, what location we're transferring from. We do use Bit Curator suite of tools. And I know that we handle fixity and checksums via file tracker is the primary method that we handle for those. And there are probably other tools as well as part of that I am just blanking on at the moment. But yes, we do have a number of different tools that we combine and work together to be able to complete the transfer process.
Very good. All right, so a question going back to our conversation about stakeholders and trying to get support for starting up or reinvigorating RAM projects. So has anybody tried to look not only at the top level, but also at the sort of frontline people doing records management, the clerks, the analysts, the office managers? Have you had any success in getting those stakeholders on board as advocates for a records management program?
I would like to speak to that. The months and months of meetings that I had one-on-one across the campus, excuse me, my little dog has decided he has issues today. Anyway, I spent months and months going across campus identifying records management representatives so that they can help me. So whenever I need to get anything across to all the stakeholders out on campus, be it the deans, any other office staff, any of the faculty, then those records management representatives are in place. And I identified a primary and a secondary for each department within each school and college across campus. And having that support base has meant everything in helping me to do my job efficiently. And we didn't have that before, and it was not good.
Okay, very good. Other thoughts on that?
You know, Beth said this earlier, but you're right that you do have to have that, you know, executive level support to get a whole program off the ground. We got lucky. I guess there was a question raised in an executive officers meeting, you know, hey, what are we doing about records management? And it turned out there wasn't a dedicated records manager, and lo and behold, 3 months later, they had one. And so, yeah, sometimes it's just luck, but yeah, I mean, even though those departmental coordinators are going to be, you know, your primary customers, almost like those are the people you're helping most directly in a lot of cases, you have to have executive level support if you're going to actually get a program off the ground, or especially if you're going to get a position created.
Okay. Anybody else?
I would just like to say, you know, I think one of our biggest things when we were rebuilding the program or redeveloping it and really trying to get those relationships in, it was those frontline people. You know, while we did have, you know, our discussions and our connections with management, city manager, county manager, all that, it was really those people who do the work every day that were really instrumental in doing this. And to say, and to prove my point, there was a time in which, you know, we were looking at a budget increase, asking for a budget increase to match the other two contracts, the other two agencies. And there were questions asked of the records clerks, you know, what is your satisfaction with what we're doing? You know, let's look at offsite storage. What would that cost? And the satisfaction and the comments that came from those records clerks were in many ways the selling point to the administration to keep us and to increase our budget. So.
Okay. So before I go on to the next thing here, were there any questions that came directly to one of the presenters that you want to go ahead and answer for the benefit of all? Okay. Well, let me go back then. There's some things that have been put into the chat that in case people don't have access to that, or for the benefit of our recording, I want to make sure that we get these down. So somebody provided some suggestions on how to start a new RIM program. And so one of those first steps would be having or conducting a high-level records inventory and a business process survey that can put together some specific examples of where an RIM program could reduce risk or reduce cost. And then try to put together a committee with at least one person designated for each department or work unit. And then finally, try to insert yourself into the existing governance committee or some sort of project, be it with IT or scanning or cleanup, so that you can get to know the people in those departments and offices better and provide assistance where you can and make records management more visible, as we've heard a number of people talking about before, and that should help you be able to build out from there. All right, let's see here. What have I overlooked? All right, so here is one. If you'll look, Krista's just launched a poll. We got a question. And so for the people in the room still, we're interested in how many of you have a records management council or some sort of body that approves retention schedules and policies and things like that.
I'm just giving it a little bit of time for folks to vote.
Sure. Thank you. So I'm fairly fascinated with these results. I would have expected it would skew a little bit more towards the yes side. So the fact that it's pretty evenly split is very interesting to me. All right, so are there other questions that any of these questions have made people think of that they want to now raise, either by raising your hand or by putting it in the chat? One other thing that came in on chat was, related to the circumstances a lot of us have been in for the past year or so. Have any of your organizations changed policies because of the work at home environment and allowed bring your own device policies, or have you, sort of kept the same protocols in place that existed in terms of security when everybody was working at work? So anybody have any expertise on that transition? Okay, so it looks like from what folks are saying in the chat, some have new policies in place. Ryan has linked to one from K-State. Others are saying basically the same protocols are in place, but just reminding people not to use personal devices. All right, so we're getting close to the end of our time here. So any other questions the presenters want to ask each other, want to ask any of our attendees based on things that have come up, or any questions that I've overlooked?
Thank you. I love the poll and your question leading, Courtney.
Thank you. Well, I do want to thank everybody for coming today. It looks like we're getting some very nice comments. So I hope all the presenters have been watching the chat to see the very kind comments that people have been putting in about your presentations. And glad that we could bring you together today to share your expertise. Remember, again, we'd love if you could share your expertise through a case study. And if you have questions about that, feel free to reach out to me directly or to anybody on the steering committee.
Thank you everyone for joining, and thank you presenters. This was fabulous, and please reach out to the Records Management Steering Committee if you have any questions, or Courtney for case studies. What a pleasure it was to gather today. Thank you, everybody.
Everybody stay healthy.
Yeah, stay healthy and safe all.
Thank you so much.